today we're going to kick off with something that was mentioned yesterday, which is a level point 2.5.
2.5.
Yeah, exactly, 2.5. And to do the presentation on how this is actually made, because it's witchcraft to the most of us, is GK the Mac,
Also known as Gavin.
Gavin, thank you very much, who will show us how to make a level 2.5 teletext on the Q teletext maker. So a ripple of round of applause, please.
Thank you very much, thank you. Right, the last presentation I did was about 30 years ago, I think, so I might be a bit out of my depth here. Okay. Can anyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, well, level 2.5, the only time it's been seen in Britain was when Pages from CFAX did a few InVision tests in the mid-1990s, and that only appeared for about a year, and then it wasn't seen again since the BBC went into digital TV, decided, no, we're not going to have teletext anymore. Boo. Yeah, so level 2.5, it's, forgive me for reading from the script here. It's something of a real enigma to those who do make level 1 teletext pages. Got a simple example up there. We've got all these new colours, in broad areas of the page, and we've got those extra changes in the foreground and the background colours, sometimes somehow without the spaces in between, because you need to leave a space between colour changes on level 1. And you've got those blocky diagonals becoming smooth slopes, like on the bunting here, and also the right-hand edge of the box. You see there? And you see those pieces of text, you've got double width and double size as well. And you're going to be thinking, how's it done? What software do you need to put all of that together, and how hard is it to do in that software? Well, the problem was, until fairly recently, there was no free-to-use teletext editing software that could do level 2.5. There was, and still is, the commercial Fab teletext editing software, which, as a guest single-user license, would probably cost several hundred or over £1,000. Yeah, it's peanuts for a public service broadcaster, but a bit too expensive for us hobbyists. So level 2.5 it's remained an enigma for far too many years, decades even. That finally changed in 2017, and there are now not one but 2 level 2.5 teletext editors that are free to use. The first was unleashed in 2017 by the genius that is Alistair C over there, setting up his tellies. He was the first to put an editor online, zxnet.co.uk, which runs in any web browser. And the second is the program Q Teletext Maker, which is this program running up here. And Q Teletext Maker doesn't run in a web browser, it's a program you have to download and install, a program or an app as they call these days. And it's the one we'll be seeing today. The fact that I wrote it myself might have means I'm a little bit biased towards it. Right, now this presentation assumes that everyone here is familiar with level 1 teletext editing, so the control codes, how the control codes take up a space by themselves, and they affect the attributes to the end of the line, how the mosaics work, or the sixels. If you want to change the background colour, you have to select the foreground colour first, double height, all those things. So if you're familiar with that, then you've got a head start. Now, this presentation, it's all about the art of editing level 2.5 pages. It's not going to go into detail on how they're actually transmitted as part of the TV picture. If you really want to know, there's the ETS specification document, although that's if you really want to know how it works, although you might spend a lot of time trying to read it, and at least 10 times as long trying to understand it. But to briefly explain, each horizontal row of text you see on the teletext page up there, it's carried, one horizontal row of text page is carried by one scan line of black and white dots in the vertical blanking interval. And those scan lines carrying the teletext data are called packets. Have I got this right, Jason? Good. And at the beginning of each packet, there's what's called a packet number. And originally that just said which row of the teletext page the page within that packet should go on. So packet number 1 carries the first row of text. Packet number 2 is the second row of text, and so on. And originally there's 23 rows of text plus a row 0 at the top, which carries what's called the rolling header. When you select the page number, you see all the page numbers going by. That comes from packet 0. For technical reasons, although there's 23 rows, the packet number can actually store numbers between 0 and 31. If you have an original teletext decoder from the 70s or early 80s, if it sees a packet number between 24 and 31, it doesn't crash or throw an error or anything like that. It just ignores it and waits for the next packet to come along. So those spare packet numbers provided some room for extensions to the original teletext specification. One of the extensions we know as fast text, which added a row 24. As well as row 24, there's also packet 27, and that carries the actual page numbers. So when you press the red number, it goes to page 101, green button goes to page 102, or yellow is page 7FA for the yellow answer to Bamboozle. Can't believe I forgot to mention that. Packet 27 tells the teletext carries the page number of where the colour button should go. Right, so there's two elements in enhancing a page in level 2.5. Okay, preventing accidents. So one is a list of enhancements stored in packet 26, where we can put additional characters and attributes in. But first we're going to look at packet 28, where we can make use of the additional colours. Now level 2.5 gives us up to 32 colours on the screen at once. Okay, at the bottom right we can see all the colours that are there. Now those colours are arranged into what's called colour lookup tables. There's CLUT 0, CLUT 1, CLUT 2 and CLUT 3, and there's 8 colour entries in each one. Now CLUT 0 has all the classic teletext colours that we all know and maybe love. And in order, those colours are black, red, green, yellow, blue, magenta, cyan, and white. Yes, cyan. Okay. Now CLUT 1, the first entry, is missing because that's defined as transparent. And the rest of a CLUT along here is the same as the classic teletext colours, but they're at half intensity. So we have half intensity red, half intensity blue, and so on, up to what you could call half intensity white, but we will call it grey. Now CLUT 2 along here has some very interesting colours in it. We start with a raspberry red, and then we have orange. Hooray. Yes, orange! Orange! Yes, and then we have some interesting shades of green, yellow, light blue, a kind of beetroot here, some kind of brown. I'm not going to tell you what I think that looks like. And finally, a pale red. And finally, CLUT 3 has some desaturated versions of the classic colours on CLUT 0. So we have a dark grey at the beginning, then we have lighter red, lighter green, lighter yellow, and so on up to a light grey. And if those colours are not quite what you need, you can actually change them. We can actually, we've got a total palette of 4,096 colours to choose from. So that big blue there, for example, which I think is this one, is it? There we are. So we've sort of picked algae fish tank green as an example. And if you don't like that, there's another 4,095 colours to choose from. There we go. So with all those colours available, how can we make use of them? Right, so here's the first page, which we probably recognise. It's the classic engineering test page from CFAX. It's got a rather big modification in the middle. Those big 8 colour squares. I'm going to have to need multiple hands for this, I think. Now it looks like they're completely the same colour from top to bottom, But there are the control codes. Or control codes, also called spacing attributes on level 1. The upper 3 rows are done with foreground colour and solid block mosaic, and the bottom 3 rows are done with background colours, and there are all spaces in there, and we'll see why in a moment. But at the moment they appear identical. And also with other teletext editors, the codes, when you reveal the codes, they're often shown as, oops, I'm not the most coordinated person in the world, but in other teletext editors, these would show up as MR for mosaic red, MG for mosaic green, MY for mosaic yellow, and so on. But in this one, it's M1 for red because it's number 1 there, and M2 for green because it's number 2, because those colours may not necessarily be red or green or whatever anymore when we start to use the extra colours. So to actually change these colours, if I try to zoom back out, we can open up this panel here called the X28 page enhancements, because packet 28 is where we make use of the colours and select which ones we want to use. So the key setting here is CLUT remapping, which says 4-0 back 0. That's short for foreground 0 and background 0, because it's selecting all the colours in CLUT 0. So if we change it to, say, 4-2 back 2, foreground 2, background 2, ta-da! And the colours have all changed, as we can see, but the question is, what have they changed to? Well, the background was black. It's now become a raspberry red, which is CLUT 2, entry 0 in CLUT 2. And the first colours in our big square, which was red to begin with, has now become orange. Yeah, we all like orange, don't we? And the next colour is that interesting shade of green, which is over here. So if you look at the colour squares and the second CLUT here, you can see the control codes, the existing control codes on our level 1 page are all picking colours from CLUT 2 on this row. So CLUT 01, which was red, has now become CLUT 21, which is orange. CLUT 05 rather is magenta, has become CLUT 25, which is our beetroot. So let's change it again. This time we're going to pick foreground 1, background 1. And you can see it's a lot dimmer, because now the control codes are selecting from CLUT 1, which is the half intensity versions of our colours. So that gives us a rather dim page. And of course, if we change it back to foreground 0, background 0, that selects the colours from CLUT 0, the classic colours there, which of course gives us our backward compatibility with level 1. Now, some of the remapping options have different numbers for the foreground and the background. Right, so let's try foreground 0, background 1. Okay. Now the parts of the squares which use the foreground and the background colour, they now look different from each other. And also the blue background behind engineering and the magenta background behind test page has changed as well. They've become dimmer. The foreground colours are still being collected from CLUT 0, but when we select the colour to use as a background, it's now coming from CLUT 1, the half intensity colour. So from this alone, we can now, still without using the enhancements, we can now use up to 16 colours on the screen at once. So let's quickly go through some more combinations of foreground and background colour. So the foreground's still CLUT 0, but the background's now CLUT 2. There's a half intensity one. And there we are. And there's foreground 2, background 2 again. And our last option is foreground from CLUT 2 which is the one that includes the orange, and the background's now coming from CLUT3, which is our desaturated ones. Now, CLUTs 2 and 3 were redefinable, so with foreground 2, background 2, we can effectively swap all the classic 8 colours in level 1 for any colours we like. So we have a custom-made colour palette, if you like, and with foreground 2, background 3, and careful use of the new background, we can have any 16 colours we like on the screen. Right, so all the while we've been playing with the colours on the page. Let's just tilt this. The border around the page, as we're going through all the CLUT options, the border around the page is staying black. But it doesn't have to be, because we can change the colour of the left and right borders using default row colour, this option here. And if I select that, you can see the left and right borders are now red, then they're green, yellow. Now the CLUT remapping doesn't affect this setting at all. We can explicitly select any of the 32 colours we want as the left and right borders. We're going through CLUT 2 now, and then CLUT 3, and going backwards. Now at the moment it's just affecting the left and right borders and not the inner page at all. But we have this tongue twisting option called black background colour substitution. And if I turn that on, ooh, got a nice yellow background. And if I cycle through the default row colours again, you can see it's now spreading into the main page. And again, we can have any one of the 32 colours we want, even the ones outside the CLUT remapping. When black background colour substitution is switched off, then the background colour, I'll change that back to the background colour in the main page, which defaults to black, it instead defaults to entry 0 of the background CLUT. So we've got background 2, so that's selecting CLUT 2 0, which is our raspberry red. And now it's background 3. So the formerly black background is now selecting CLUT 3 0, which is our dark grey. And of course we can redefine those colours if we wanted to. And finally we can change the colours of the top and bottom borders using this first option called default screen colour. Again, any one of our 32 colours we want. So that's how we use Packet 28 to change the colours, and as we've already seen, just changing the colours, that's often all we need to make a 2.5 artwork stand out from level 1, shall we say. Now the other part of level 2.5 is what's called enhancements. And that's where we can overwrite selected parts of the level 2.5 page. Now this next page coming up, I notice Alistair's left the room because it's one of his pages that we're about to see, which he put together when he first researched level 2.5. And it quickly shows all we can do with the Packet 26 enhancements in action. I quickly undo those and go to that page. Here it is. It's a one-page view of everything we can do in level 2.5, or most things we can do in level 2.5. And this page, it's actually on TFAX page 753. So if you watch TFAX using a Raspberry Pi linked to an actual television, then when you get home, turn it on, select page 753 of TFAX, and who knows, if you've got a modern telly, it might have been capable of level 2.5 all along without you knowing. So there's all the enhancements, and we're going to bring up another window called X26 Triplets. And this is a list of all the enhancements that's been made to the page. Now, each of these enhancement commands They tend to be called triplets, and they're called that because of the way that each of those commands tends to be encoded across 3 bytes in the packet data. And each triplet, it controls a cursor called what's called the active position. And the idea is you move the active position to a certain row and column on the page where you want to apply an enhancement, and then say what enhancements you want to put there. And most of the triplets combine first moving the active position to somewhere on the screen and then applying an enhancement at the resulting position in just one instruction. Now, what's really hard about this is we have to be careful to lay out these enhancements in what's called screen address order. So you have to do it from the top row to the bottom row, and within each row you have to put the enhancements in from left to right. So in other words, the active position can't move upwards and it cannot move leftwards within the same row. It all has to be in the right order. So this triplet here called set active position, that's used to move the active position to row 2, which is this row here. And then the next triplet says 38 foreground color CLUT01. And that means to first move the active position to 38, column 38, which is here, and apply a foreground colour of CLUT01, which is down here. So in other words, it's turning this star red. So if I alter the column number of this triplet, I'm going to wind it back to, move the cursor out of the way, I'm going to wind it back, and you can see that the red is starting to spread. So it's now column 26, so the red effect is starting from column 26. And that does a remarkable feat of changing the colour in the middle between each character. We're finally set free from the limitation of having to leave a space for a control code without hell mosaics. And also, the reason it's on row 2 is because of this set active position here. So if I alter that to row 1, you can see it's now moving up and down like that. And this ability to apply attributes in the middle of text, it's also why they're called non-spacing attributes, as opposed to spacing attributes in level 1. And as for which colour, we can, again, unlike the CLUT remapping, which only affects the level 1 spacing attributes, we can explicitly select any of the 32 colours we want. There's orange, through CLUT 2, and there's CLUT 3. So the broad idea of making a level 2.5 page with pretty colours is to use the CLUT remapping to turn broad areas to the colours you want, and then you might want to put in extra colours here and there, and you can use the non-spacing attributes for that. So here's a further example of the every CLUT being used to set the foreground colour for each one of those stars. Now background colour, now again by moving this to the left, we can see that we can put it bang straight in the middle. And we can change the background colour immediately to any colour we want. We're not stuck with the level 1 changing the foreground colours first and then the new background and then the foreground colour again, which is a bit messy if you ask me. We can put any background colour at any position we want, and again from any CLUT. We hope I did it the right way. Like that. Now, as well as non-spacing attributes, we can also overwrite characters with new ones, and this is the first example here, which is called diacritical mark. Now, on level 1, when it comes to dealing with other languages, there's only a limited amount of diacritical or characters with accents that we can use, because I think there's only 13 positions which have spare characters, and when you select your language, you can only use a limited number of them. You know, I think in the Spanish and Portuguese one, you can only accent the lowercase characters, you can't accent the uppercase ones. But with this triplet here, we're not stuck with that. We can apply any diacritical we want to any character we want. It's like changing it to I, and we can do it to like accented J or accented K, L, M. I don't know if any other languages actually use those. And we can also change which diacritical we want. Of course, being a native English speaker, I don't know what they're all called, but that's the accent going one way, and there's the accent going the other way. Now, this particular enhancement, this is only one of a very few enhancements that's also available on level 1.5. What's level 1.5? Level 1.5, it's broadly the same as level 1. It still only has the 8 colours, and it still only has the existing spacing attributes. But there are a couple of enhancements which are supported on 1.5, and this is one of them. So the idea is, if telemakers wanted to make cheaper tellies which didn't support all the level 2.5 stuff, they could choose to support just level 1.5 and just allow more flexibility in the accented characters. Right, now this is going to be rather fun. We're going back to attributes, additional flash functions. Okay. So again, we can apply this attribute straight in the middle of our characters. And we've got several flash modes to choose from. Now the stars down here are done using level 1 control codes. So that's flashing control code there, and there's steady there. And that's actually flashing in sync with this one here because it's set to normal. If we change to invert, it's now going in the opposite phase, and we can actually choose parts of the screen to flash in normal phase and other parts to flash in invert phase. I might be able to demonstrate it here. Okay, so you can see there's 2 different phases opposite each other. And as well as the additional phases, we also have another option called adjacent CLUT. Now this time, the dashes are not disappearing completely, they're flipping to a different colour. The actual colour it's changing to is, it started out as white, so it's going between these 2 colours here, CLUT 07, CLUT 17, which is white and dark grey. If it was in CLUT 2 or 3, then it would alternate between those rows. So if it was CLUT 2, 4, our blue one, it would alternate between those. And as well as that relatively low rate, we also have faster rates. I'll change that to, so you can see that's actually blinking a bit faster now than on the normal 1 Hz flash on the other side. And if I pull this across, when you do the rapid flashing, there's actually 3 phases to choose from. So that's phase 1. So that's phase 1 here, and phase 2 there. And you can see we've actually got a bit of what looks like movement. This one's appearing first, and that one's appearing second. There's a 3rd phase as well. So now it looks like it's going in the other direction. And as well as applying broad areas of phase to broad areas, we can also do what's incremental or decremental phasing, which gives us a colour cycling effect. Here it is. So the phases 1, 2, 3 are repeating across each character automatically from left to right. So the dashes appear to be moving from left to right. That's incremental. We also have decremental, and now they're going in the other direction. Let's put that back to how it was. Right, now we're coming to overwriting characters again. Now, G0 characters is basically a fancy name for alphanumeric characters, letters, numbers, punctuations, and so on. And if we want to, we can overwrite it. And again, I'm moving the column of this particular one. Now, what's special is, if I put in some mosaics, say, if I can remember what buttons to press, escape to. So there, I've turned this to mosaics, but the character we're overwriting is still from the G0 step. It's still alphanumeric. I'll move the cursor that way. So if I move it backwards and forwards, it's on top of the level 1 alphanumerics. And if I move it into the mosaics, it's still appearing as alphanumeric, and it's not affecting the mosaics on the other side either. And it can also overwrite the control code I put there, and it can also overwrite the control codes and still leave them intact. So you can see as it passes through the control code, it's not affecting it. The control code is there, and it's a set after, so the green actually starts there, as you can see now. Undo that. And we can overwrite a block, a G1 mosaic, which is just a fancy name for the block mosaics you have on level 1. And again, it doesn't have to be mosaic on the underlying level 1 page. We can actually move it through and keep the mouse steady. You can see it's, again, the mosaic's appearing slap bang in the middle and not affecting the level 1 page around it. Now we have G2 supplementary characters. I'm not showing up well, so I'll do it this way. Now these are kind of additional characters like cents, pound sign, dollars. We've got some more arrows. We've got more fractions to choose from and things from other languages. Got diacriticals there, copyright, trademark, and even a musical note there, which is there. And this is another enhancement which is also available on level 1.5. I've switched to level 1.5. You can see the musical note is still there. Okay, now we're coming on to the G3 smooth mosaics, which I think is the most fun bit of 2.5, apart from orange. Now, if you picture a square and cut it in half once diagonally, then that's the characters you can choose from in G3. I think they're showing up pretty well on the big screen. Got a few line drawing ones as well. These are all the ones you can choose from. And this is actually tested twice. We've got G3 mosaic at level 1.5 and G3 mosaic at level 2.5, 3.5. Now, in theory, the theory is on level 1.5 you can use smooth mosaics as well, but in practice, the vast majority of level 1.5 decoders don't do this. And my telly at home actually does a completely messed up bug, which I won't go into detail. So it's best to avoid mosaics on level 1.5, just assume they're not going to work. Now when we move the active, now all the while we've been moving the active position down to row 9 for the flash functions, row 10. We've just been moving it down using those set active positions. Another way to move it down is this one here called full row colour. Now in the engineering page earlier we were changing the colours of the left and the right borders, and the borders were changing in their entirety all to the same colour. Well, with this full row colour enhancement, we can actually change different parts of the border to different colours. So here we're changing it to CLUT 01 there, and on row 16 it's changing to the half red, and on 17 it's changing to the orange. So we can change them on a row by row basis, even have a different full row colour on every single row if we wanted to. And when we change the colour, we can either apply it just to the row. I'm changing this one here. It can either apply just to the single row, or if we change it from down to bottom, it can then spread downwards to the bottom of the page unless it encounters another full row colour in the middle. So you could have a sky up here and then a single full row colour triplet for green land down to bottom. Now at the moment, so we're going to go back to black background colour substitution, which earlier spread the border colours into the main page. If we turn that on, the full row colours are now propagating into the main page. And you may have seen level 2 artworks where the sky is all different colours. Well, this is how it's done. So again, we can have a gradient sky up there and green for grassy land down there. And using black background colour substitution, spread those onto the main page. That's turned off again. Now, display attributes is a collection of miscellaneous ones, which we haven't done so far. We can change the text size. If I turn those off first, we can change the text size. We have normal size, we have double height, and level 2.5 also introduced double width, which I think is very nice as long as you don't use it too much, and double size as well. And as well as those, we can there are some other effects we can change with just this one enhancement here. We've got boxing window. That does the same as the start box and end box does on news, fashion, subtitle pages. So if this was in mixed mode or a subtitle page, that text would be boxed. We have conceal, which is the same as the level 1 code, which conceals it until reveal is pressed. And we have this one invert, which swaps the foreground and the background colours. And then finally we have this one here, which has two effects. If there's any alphanumeric characters, they now become underlined like this. And I wonder if I can... Ah yes, there we are. And the other effect it has, if there's any mosaics, they will be shown in their separated forms. Separated, yes. Continuous, contiguous. I don't know which one of those it is. Okay, so we're going to rewrite history. See, all the enhancements have been put there to begin with, so now we're going to enhance a page. We're going to rewrite history. Now, this is not from a recovery. This was manually copied by myself many, many years ago from a black and white photograph in a book. So the colours are, apart from the classic banner, the colours definitely won't be correct. So we're going to do what if here. What if in Oracle enhanced level 2.5 and wanted to smooth out their banner? We're going to put some enhancements on. And once again, we must be mindful of, we have to do the layout enhancements from top to bottom and then from left to right in each row. So we want to put enhancements on the first row first. So we put set active position. And now I want to introduce a G3 smooth mosaic. It's appeared up there. And now we pick this particular shape. And now we're going to move it into the correct position. I want to put it on column 10. There we are. So there's the first bit there. And I want to put another enhancement next door. So it's easier to just copy that, nudge it to the next column, and then pick the correct shape. And there we are. So we've done the top left, so now we need to do the same to the top right. Let's enhance this one. That's put there. And we'll need another one on the other side, which I think is 35. And then move that to the correct position. There we go. So we've smoothed the top half, but we've got a problem here. We've got this fleck of green appearing here. Now, why is that appear? Let's go in and turn on the control codes, you see where that is, there's a level 1 control code changing it to Mosaic 1, but that is set after. The red is not applying here. The red is not applying here, it's applying in the next column. So we've got to fix that. So what we do is we put in a foreground colour before. And there we are, we fixed the problem. So we've done it for the top, and now we just need to do it for the bottom. So again, now the bottom is row 5. So again, let's move the active position down to row 5. And then a G3 mosaic. There it is again. And again, I'll select the shape first and then move it across. Copy that. And then I think it's that one, yeah. Right, now the bottom right to do. You can probably already see why there's not many level 2.5 pages. It's quite fiddly doing all of this, and again we've got our anomaly in from the set after red. So again we'll fix that. Insert a foreground colour before, change it to red, and there we are. Okay, so what else can we do? This I think this mosaic headlines. It's quite chunky. You know, we could replace with a proper underline if you like. So, but before we do that, we need to blot out this here. So this all happens on row number 9. So let's put that there. Oops. And I'm going to use the G3 character to blot it out. Okay, so that's just one, and again one at a time. We blot out the okay, just 3 more columns. There we are. Right, so we've blotted out that, and now we need to go back up and put our actual underline underneath the headlines. So let's insert after on row 8. So we move it up to row 8, and then put in a display attributes, and put in our underline. Oh, it's not working. Oh. Okay. Right, so we moved it down to row number 9 to blot out the mosaic there. There it is. And we're trying to move it back up to put in the display attributes, but it's not working. Does anyone know why? Exactly. I wondered if anyone would spot that. We've moved the active position up. And if I'd been more careful about this, the red is in number 8. The number 8 is in red, rather. There you go. It's helpfully telling me that the active position can't move up. Okay, so let's do this properly. So that's where we move it to row number 9. Insert the 4 active position on row 8. And then use our display attributes. Underline. There's our underline at last. Start it from column 1, and as you can see it's underlining all the way across, so we need to put in another display attributes triplet. Turn off underline. And there we are, there's a nice neat underline there. So we pop between level 1 and level 2.5, we can see how the different versions look now. Okay, so these green mosaics here, let's make those a darker green. So we'll go to the end of our list. Active position. So that to row 19. And then afterwards, let's do it this way this time. Foreground colour. Clup 1.5 is, oh no, it's Clup 1.2. Is dark green. You can see it's applying it from column 0 already, but this bit is staying light green because there's a spacing attribute here, which still overrides the non-spacing attribute we put at the start. So we'll move this across. We're moving the column upwards, and there we are. So now the enhancement is there. It's now ahead of the mosaic spacing attributes there. And we can do the same for the next line, which is row 23. The foreground colour defaults to black for some reason. Okay, let's move it to the correct row, and then the correct column. And there we are. Now what else can we do? The ITVs at the top stop at the left and right. We could do some full row colouring to make those spread all the way across. So we've already set the active position at the start to row 1, which is so we can put these enhancements in. So we're going to change that to a full row colour, and then change that to there. Okay, you can see the row colour has changed, but we've got another anomaly here. We've got a gap, because this is where column 0 is rather. No, column 0. And the effects of the full row colour stop there. So we can go back here, turn on black background colour substitution. I managed to say it. Okay, and then we want to cancel. We want to cancel the effect here on row 6. I should have done this first. So of course we want to spread it down here, but only as far as the bottom of the Oracle banner. So between rows 5 and 8, we put in a full row colour. Full row colour black down to bottom. And there we are. And as you can see, we've introduced another problem. We've obliterated the black bits of the red banner like that. So what we have to do now is put in a background colour on column 1. We have to turn the background colour back to black, like Amy Winehouse, to make that bit visible again. So, of course, now we need to move the active position to all parts of the Oracle logo to make this happen. Background colour. So the background colour black starts from there, and of course we want to start it from column 1. Okay. Background colour, again from column 1, and copy, 4. Background colour 0 again, and then one last time. And there we are. We've got a nice simple 2.5 enhanced ITV logo here. Again, we pop it back to level 1. We can compare the two like that. So you can see, again, why 2.5 wasn't popular if we had to do all that mucking about just for simple effects. Okay, so we come to the last bit of the show, and that's to show you some level 2.5 artworks that I've made over the years. We won't just be looking at them like you see on pages from CFAX. We'll actually be delving into some of the tricks of the triplets that make the enhancements that you see, and we'll also see what they look like on level 1 decoders. Remember kids, when making level 2.5 artwork, never forget level 1. Never forget that fallback. So we're going to come to the very first artwork that I made. Okay. So here we have a simple palette remap. The red turns to brown, not orange, but brown. The yellow is more like amber. But the most obvious thing is the G3 smooth mosaics, which make the double Z less blocky. Now, only broad things can be really smooth this way because of the cut in half nature of the G3 characters. You can't really smooth really finely defined stuff like the top here. So the top remains blocky. It's quite common to see that on 2.5 artwork. And there's all the so row 9 is the first row that the mosaics are applied. I think row 10 is where the ambers apply, so it's a bit more obvious. So we have those two mosaics there and those two mosaics there and so on. And there's level 1. So our brown was remapped from red and our amber was remapped from yellow. And there's the blocky, the blocky slopes there. So that was the first artwork I made. And here is the second. Still one of my favourites today, actually. Now, this is mostly a palette remap. Here it is on level 1. So, again, remapping is used for broad areas of colours that you want to change. So the red on the top and left and the magenta on the right has become different shades. And we also introduced some extra colours here and there. So the lips and the necklace, they stay black on level 1. With level 1, this is white mosaics on the black background, and it has to stay that way because when you deal with black background, changing back to black background again with held mosaics is pretty tricky stuff. So that's why they're left as black on level 1. And we've got some other enhancements going on here, such as the background is left black here for this tufts of hair up there. That becomes a light grey. And also the separated lines of hair up here, which are white, they become dark grey. Right, and a bit of a controversial feature here. The text at the top is double width, which was introduced in level 2.5 as an enhancement. But if I pop to level 1, the double width is still there. That's because as well as the display attributes, where you put the enhancements in the middle of the picture, you had the level 1 control codes, all the colours, normal height, double height. There were some gaps there. So you had normal height text, double height text. There was a couple of gaps in the codes afterwards, and they used those gaps to put in double width and double height. Now, officially, those codes are only supposed to work on level 2.5 decoders, but again, in the real world, a lot of modern tellies will happily obey double width and double height. And I've actually seen a few examples on European teletext of level 1 pages actually using double width and double height there. Level 2.5 also introduced black foreground on an official basis. Yes, black foreground, which a lot of tellies made since the 90s, I think, actually interpret, even though they're not supposed to on level 1. Now, Q Teletext Maker is admittedly a teletext editor for the modern age, which is why I choose personally to do the double width and double height stuff even on level 1. Right, so we're going back to G3 Smooth Mosaics. Here's my favourite example of how they can use to smooth out chunky text. Here we are. Now, if I turn the grid on, I don't know how we can see that. Yeah, that's a bit better. If I turn the grid on, you can see that the characters, particularly in DEF CON, they're mostly one character cell thick. You know, the filled mosaic block there. So because of that, it's actually quite easy to simply round the corners. There's level 1 again. It's quite easy to round the corners there. And as well as the cut in half bit, we've also got some bits with triangles cut out of, and this bit of the 3 here has one of those. Smoothing out the 2 and the 4 was slightly harder. You can see the 4 is not quite perfect. So that's an easy example of how you can smooth out text. Here's a more difficult example. Please Hammer Don't Hurt 'Em. It's a part of an album cover. There's something about album covers which Teletext owner artists like to copy. Now again, this is mostly G3 mosaics, and where it says please, it's one character cell thick. Again, there's the level blocky version. I go in. Now the hammer and the hurt, they were more difficult to do because I had to restrict the enhancements to the corners, because again, a G3 mosaic, you can only cut a piece in half. You can't cut a piece then cut another piece. So this part of hurt, I was able to do the smooth bit there, but I wasn't able to do the smooth bit there because you'd have to cut it along there and then along there. So as well as that, the A of hammer also has a bit of an awkward angle there, because again I could only make one straight cut. Again, there's level 1.5 blockiness. Okay, now this is a bit of a strange one. Now this is a parody of one of the earliest internet memes. It actually dates back to the year 2000. Does anyone remember when Adobe Flash? Yeah. Well, a lot of pages about the year 2000, they would have a Flash intro, an intro to Adobe Flash, which would have these lovely panning effects and movement effects and so on. And then they would give way to a rather bland web page, and despite the flashy intro, you couldn't really do much beyond the standard website. This parody, it just does this over and over again, and you hear a voice saying, "You can do anything at Zombra.com," and that website does still exist. It's rewritten for HTML5, but it's otherwise exactly the same. So the most obvious thing is we have the 3-phase flash enhancements to make the circles appear to move. There's the level 1 version. I've not bothered to put a white background on the level 1 version, and as you can see, everything's become blocky again. So you've got G3 smooth mosaics rounding out the circles and the 3-phase flash. And I'm using invert flash mode, so the circles spend more time switched on than they do switched off. But also at the top, I'm going to zoom in so the circles don't distract us too much. At the very top, we have a 2.5 gradient, and it fades from a sort of minty green to a white. So there's the first colour, there's the second colour, and so on. And we've got CLUTs. All the colours are in the gradient are defined there. So CLUT 3.0 is at the top. CLUT 3.1 is the next one down. Now, this one has an enhancement on row 0. It actually has an enhancement put on row 0, which is done by this special enhancement here, which is called address row 0. Now, this moves the active position to 0, and you can actually change it to... It's actually possible to misuse this facility, if you like, to overwrite the rolling header. The star up there, that's where the rolling header would be, so you could actually abusively change Teletext Limited to something else. I mean, goodness knows what Mr. Biffo would have done with his full-page adverts if he could overwrite the header there. So yes, I'm butchering the header with putting a star in, but it does have a legitimate use. if you put a light colour right at the very top, say if this was white, you then can't see the rolling header anymore because it's white on a very light background. So what you could do is put in, so if you had a white background here, you could put in a black foreground, say at position 8 or 9, which would turn the rolling header black and make it visible again. And on column 32, you could put another foreground colour, say red or orange, to replace the yellow of the clock to make that more readable. Okay, now the next artwork, I'm going to show this in level 1 first, because this is what I call phantom control codes. When you see this page on level 1, you'll see control codes, but there'll be nothing in front of them. You might be thinking, why are they there? Here it is. You might have seen this on the screen yesterday. Now this is, now we've got double-sized text again on level 1, being a bit naughty. This is based on a poster I saw in the supermarket, which was advertising a car boot sale, so I just took a picture of that and made a mental note. I just had to do it in level 2.5 teletext for the bunting. Okay, so we've got a trick going on with double-sized text here. Double-sized text courtesy of the level 1 control codes. Even on level 1 we have double-sized letters and spacing attributes. The letters are still different colours because the R of everyone is in this cell here, and in this cell we put in an attribute. So the character is defined at the top left quadrant, and the top right we can put in a control code which is set after, and that will affect the next character along. I want to draw your attention to the bunting. So here we have the bunting done as mosaics, and we have the mosaic control codes to change the colours. Like we have the green one here for the first row, and we have a green mosaic code here for the second row of bunting, but we also have a third one, and there's nothing in front of it. So why are they there? Does anyone know?
Because the point that you're putting doesn't exist in level 1.
It doesn't exist in level 1. Does it exist in level 2.5? You are correct, sir. There we are. Again, I've used one of the sort of triangle enhancements here to define this bit of the bunting as well as the G3 mosaics to apply it. So the level 2.5 adds this extra tip here, which is coloured in by the spacing attributes. So even if something doesn't appear on level 1 but only on 2.5, we can still put in control codes for, in the event when it is on level 2.5, they become the correct colours. And again, we've got some double-sized text up here. And we've also got these underline bits here, because again, in the original poster, it had these blocks of text separated by lines. So I put in the underline effect to simulate that. And we have another example of the address row 0 triplet to make this time it does make the rolling header visible. But this time it changes it does a full row colour of the dark blue, CLAT1 So the white background would make the rolling header visible in there. So as a courtesy, we put address row 0 in there to make the rolling header visible. Now there's more phantom control codes coming up in this next artwork. Now I do apologise, I've had to partially redact this one because it contains an international trademark owned by an international company with humongous profits, which means they have a much bigger budget than lawyers than I could ever afford, or even us all together. Even if we all paid for lawyers ourselves, it wouldn't match their budget, but here it is. Carl, I don't know if you're ready for this. Okay, there was a rather controversial TV advert made in fake teletext last year, and of course I couldn't resist recreating it in genuine teletext.
Dr. Marbles. It's a Scottish restaurant.
Ja, ich mache viel Replacement, man muss auch
Okay, right. Let's zoom in to the burger, the blocky burger. There's nothing quite like a blocky burger. Okay, so here we've got the control codes again. Now, in the top letter slice, first we have held mosaics, and then we have a couple of black background control codes here. Now, again on level 1, there's no apparent purpose for them to be there, because we're changing the background to black, but it's still black, on level 1 at least. And as you probably guessed, the black backgrounds are going to cancel out some level 2.5 enhancements. And there they are. I don't know if you can see, but there's a couple of... It's these two enhancements here, which put in a dark green background here. I think they're supposed to be gherkins, I think. Blocky gherkins. But those enhanced background colours are being applied there and there. And we use the level 1 black background to stop the effect. So even though, so again we're using 2.5 enhancements but cancelling them out with level 1 control codes. Now in the bottom letter slice as well, we have on level 1, we have some gaps here. Just either side of the bit where the cheese is dripping out there and there, because we have some control codes here. Now on the level 2.5 version, I put in some enhancements to fill those in. Let's see if I can find them. So this particular enhancement here, 1722, row 17.22, is being applied there on top of the control code. So applying an enhancement there doesn't cancel out the control code again. It still turns to yellow. And on the other side, we've got another mosaic to fill in this one. And like when we were doing the Oracle logo earlier, we had that fleck of green. We had to put in the foreground colour to cover that up. And again, we have foreground colour to cloud that effect. Okay, we zoom out. Now there is another mysterious difference between the level 1 and the 2.5 versions. If I just swap between them repeatedly, you can see the British and Irish beef bit here is going double height only on 2.5. So why didn't I double height them on level 1 then? I'll show you why, if I can get this right. Because double height, there we go. You can see when I double height that, it completely knackers the burger up, as someone else said. Even if I change it to single height, it still obliterates part of the burger, because on level 1, if you apply a double height control code anywhere on the row, whatever's on the bottom row is going to get obliterated. I'll just undo the damage there. And on 2.5, we have display attributes to apply the double height there. If we only use enhancements to trigger the double height, then when we change back to single height later on, then what's on the bottom row is shown again. There's actually quite complicated rules when it comes to mixing non-spacing double height and spacing double height, and what happens on the bottom row is quite complicated. Now, as well as phantom control codes, if that isn't enough, what about phantom mosaics? Okay, now row 8, which is here, that just looks like a white background with nothing on it. But if I put in a row mosaic control code here, we have some hidden lines here. We've got some hidden mosaics on the level 1 page, and you don't see them because they're hidden by white background on white foreground. But of course on level 2.5, when we were playing with the CLUT remapping, we could see that the foreground colours and background colours can be different colours. So the foreground comes from CLUT 2, which is colour 7 is white, and the background colour comes from CLUT 3, which is a dark grey. And if we kick in 2.5, there are the mosaics. They make the top and the bottom of the window frames, because here the set bits of the mosaic sixels are appearing in CLUT 2.7, and the background colour where the sixels are unset are in CLUT 3.7. The vertical ones are much more complicated, as you can probably see in the triplet list here. You can see we're swapping about between background colours and foreground colours all the time. The one at the bottom right was quite tricky to pull off. And of course we have G3 smooth mosaics making the roof of the house. And again, because we can only cut them in half, the chimney and the top of the house are not quite right. And also we have black background colour substitution plus full row colours to make the uniform sky background. So the default row colour rather is a darker shade of blue here. And halfway down we have this full row colour on row 20, applies CLUT 3.1, kind of this sort of reddish brown colour. Right, now this one is actually quite complicated. I don't know if I'm going to have enough time to explain how this works. Now, this is a copy of an image by the abstract artist Hiroshi Nagai. There he is credited. And we have a subtle sunset gradient on the top half, courtesy of full row colour enhancements on each row, so that it appears on the left and the right. And we use black background colour substitution to spread it across the full rows. But it doesn't quite work here, because on level 1 we have a magenta mosaics followed by a new background. So that means it's going to so the full row colour display here effectively gets stopped if I delete this background colour here. So without an additional background colour there, the full row colour stops here, because that's where the magenta new background has been done. So we have to reapply the foreground colour. So for each band of this gradient, we have to specify the two enhancements, one for the full row colour, and the other to reapply it as a background colour when we trigger Mosaics Magenta on the left side. And you can see the background colour there, which you'd think would be the same. It's CLUT 1.0, which means transparent. And transparent in this case means set it to the same as the full row colour. So in row 6, we've got some complicated colour changes going on, because that's where the sun first appears. And I'll just show it on level 1. So you can see we've got some whole mosaics, new background, more mosaics, back to black backgrounds, and so on. It's complicated enough on level 1. But so we have to reapply the background colour as well. But if we just use CLUT 1.0, we can set it to the same as the full row colour. So if I change it to something different, so those enhancements which are applying the transparent, they just reapply this background colour here. So it's quite complicated. Things get much simpler when we get to the C, which starts from this row. Because here, so again we've got blue mosaics, then new foreground to make the C blue. But this time the colour it's been mapped to is the same as the full row colour, so we don't have to keep reapplying the C colour here. But because we're using black background colour substitution, we have some black background attributes on the buildings, on the left and right of the buildings. So again, with black background colour substitution, we have to reapply the background colour on the left side of each building as well. So if there's one here, if I take that out, although the level 1 page is calling for a black background there, it's just going to become the same as the full row colour, which means we lose the the black of the building there. So again, we have to reapply it using enhancement. Okay, after that rather complicated gradient wrangling, let's end with something rather simple, one of my more popular artworks. Right, do we know whose cat this is?
Unfortunately, he's not here anymore.
No, he was here yesterday, but he's not here today. Nathan Dane, his cat Whiskers often appears in his videos, and I traced it from a photograph, admittedly. Okay, so this has a lot of orange in it. But one must never forget that all level 2.5 artwork still has to look good in level 1. And when you create a level 2.5 artwork that has orange in it, there is a big question you have to ask yourself. On level 1, should the orange, should it appear as red or should it appear as yellow? In other words, do you want your level 1 Fanta to be lemon or fruit twist? Okay, so here it is on level 1. I've chosen for the cat to become red because the control codes on level 1 are red foreground, which is picking from CLUT 1. That remaps to 2-1, which is of course orange. So if you wanted the orange, there's a bit of yellow there underneath the cat's mouth as well. So if we're doing an artwork and you wanted the orange to appear yellow instead, you'd have to use yellow foreground attributes, and you'd have to select, which is CLUT 03, and you'd have to set CLUT 23 to whatever shade of orange you wanted. And as well as that, this is also quite simple. We got some enhancements here to round out the blocky corners of her eyes. So there it is on level 1 again. And we also use separated mosaics for the sort of darker shades of ginger on her coat. And on 2.5, we put in some enhancements, there they are, about here, to make it a darker shade of ginger, which is here. And that is the end. I'm hoping this has at least, well, if I've explained this all properly, I hope it's at least demystified the inner workings of how to edit level 2.5 pages, and maybe it's made some of you want to have a go at level 2.5 editing yourself, because there are two, not just me, there are two level 2.5 experts in this room, and I don't think it's enough. We need more level 2.5 artists. Now it's more common on tellies. So the software we've seen today is QTeletext Maker. It's still officially in beta, but as you can see, it's quite usable. If you want to have a go at that, you can head to the page on GitHub, there's the address, and you can if you head to releases on the GitHub page, you can download a zip of the latest Windows build, which at the moment is 0.6.4 beta. Inside the zip, you'll find an XE, but it's not an installer. Just extract that XE anywhere in File Explorer, run it, and you might get a Windows Smart Screen warning in your face, but bypass that. And as well as the editor itself, there's also some example TTI pages inside, some of which we've seen in this presentation. So that's how you get it going under Windows. Under Linux or however you pronounce it, there isn't a package or anything like that as of yet. You can either download the zip of the source code, or you can use git clone if you're fancy. Make sure you have CMake and the Qt widget libraries installed. Have a look at the README on how to compile it, and you'll have yourself a native Linux level 2.5 teletext editor. Or if you don't fancy mucking about with software, an alternative level 2.5 editor is Alistair C's zxnet.co.uk. That runs straight away in any web browser, any modern web browser. A lot of you will be familiar with that already, but it isn't that well known that it can do level 2.5 unless you've had a deep look at the options. Next time you run it, there's a little thing at the bottom there called Enhancement Editor. Click that, and you'll be able to remap the colours easily and check the palettes. To do the enhancements, there's a bit called X/26 editor, which opens in a separate window, which is tricky to use. It's no more trickier than the one we've used today. Announce fiddly, yes. Thank you. Yeah, it's a bit more fiddly to use, but it is still pretty usable. So that's an alternative editor you can use if you don't want to muck out fancy editing software. I was on the social network formerly known as Twitter, but I don't use it much these days since of the cesspit it's become. The best place to contact me or see my artwork is on Mastodon at gkmag at oldbytes.space. I'm also on the Twitter alternative Blue Sky at gkmag at bsky.social. And that is it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's sort of like having Rembrandt turning up to cut in round your windows, isn't it? That's excellent. Are there any questions from that at all? Yes, an arm was flicked up straight away, and I think that we're going straight to Jason.
That was brilliant, Gavin.
Thank
that was
you.
very interesting. So I know a little bit about level 2, but that's kind of like, I did not know that the active position could only go downwards, so I've definitely learned something there. Do you think it's possible to do animations like the ones I've had running on here? Do you reckon it's possible to do animations like that in level 2, or is it not fast enough?
I have a feeling it might not be fast enough because there's kind of two grades of level 2.5 decoders. The one I've got at home is a Panasonic level 2.5. It was made in about 2008. That appears to have what I call a character generator ROM in it. You know, you just set a byte and the character appears straight away, and then set another byte or two for the foreground and background colours. I think with those, it's probably easy, or you might have to turn down the frame rate. There are some big Samsung tellies which seem to work by plotting all the pixels of the character onto a canvas, and I've seen a couple of comments that when they do level 2.5, the three-phase flash, the software on them actually slows down a bit. So if level 2.5 can choke Samsung tellies that use large areas of three-phase flash, then you might get into trouble. I'm not really sure what would happen if you put on a list of enhancements in packet 26 and then you put in the level 1 page, packets 1 to 24. I'm not really sure what would happen if you put in a set of new level 1 packets. I'm not really sure if that would erase the old enhancements or not. So if your animation had a van with a smooth windscreen, you put the level 1 van there with the 2.5 to make a smooth windscreen. If you then send some new packets to redraw the van further along, you'd have to. I'm not really sure if the enhancements would stay there, or if you'd had to put in some new enhancements, refreshing enhancements again to make them stay there.
I think there's definitely different ways of rendering it on TVs, because some TVs can't even cope with the level 1 animations. They're so slow to draw. So you're
Yes.
right there. Yeah. I mean, do non-space and attributes do away with held graphics mode?
They can do. Yeah, you definitely can put them anywhere you want, as we saw in the in the packets example earlier. But once again, we must never forget level 1. So
That's true. Yeah, because I know a lot of artists steer away from held graphics because they're quite complicated, aren't they?
that's right. Yes, as well as putting attributes in the middle, as we saw when we moved the G1 mosaic block across, like on the fast food restaurant we had earlier. We had the extra mosaics on either side of the dripping cheese. We put in a couple of extra G1 block mosaics there.
One more question. Does the software match any reference hardware?
No. Well, the only reference hardware really is I couldn't have written this software at all without the genius that is Alistair sitting in the background. It was his, when I came across his editor, I always wanted to write a 2.5 editor, and when I came across his editor, saw it was possible, it was only when I had a look at the workings of that, because I had the ETSI spec, it was only when I saw that and I started putting sort of custom bytes into the x26 enhancements, that's when it all started to fall into place. But to answer your question, it's one, I did use Alistair's as kind of a reference, not directly copying the code, but just to see how things behaved. And not long after that, I inherited my late dad's Panasonic telly, which I discovered for the first time had a 2.5 decoder in it. And I just, all I do is just write something in my renderer, which I think it will work this way. But to make doubly sure, I connect it up to a Pi, send a TTI, have a look at the telly, what that does, and see how my decoder behaves into it. So I try to copy how my Panasonic decoder behaves.
Yeah.
That's my only reference, if you like.
Yeah. So,
And of course, there's the ETSI reference document as well. But again, you'll be spending the rest of your life reading that before you come up with a spec on that alone.
yeah, I wonder if we can do animations with it. It's sort of like we can change the full row colour to simulate a spectrum loading packs with the flashing lights.
Yes, or maybe a sunrise. Say.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of hacky things you might want to try with level 2, but it means such a rich set of instructions. There's all sorts of.
Yes.
So many people try to push the boundaries of level 1 to the limits, but the level 2 boundaries I don't think have been tested.
Yes.
So there's lots of interesting research and experimentation to be done there.
Yes, I think with when it comes to blasting out TTI files like your bad Apple or your T42, I think unless you set a clear page in the TTI file, then when it goes to the next subpage, the old page won't be erased. So that would be a good starting point, such as the sunrise picture with the plane over it. Maybe put that in as a subpage, and then maybe make another page just with the full row colours and doing the sunrise, but slightly lighter colours. Just do that and see if all the buildings and the plane, etc., stays on the page when you do that. It would be quite interesting to try that out.
Yeah, good idea. It's also got. I know I keep asking questions. Sorry,
No, that's fine.
It's got parallels with Petsky from the Commodore 64.
Yes, it has.
Characters. I wonder if you could sort of take artworks from the Petsky world, and bring them over to level 2.5 world.
No.
There's things like there's like hearts and clubs and hollow circles and
Yeah.
things that aren't necessarily.
Yeah, there is when you would compare it to Petsky. I've not seen Petsky, but I think where you cut the mosaics in half. I think in Petsky you can only cut it from halfway across each edge, whereas with G3 Smooth Mosaics you can start your cut from halfway across the top and the bottom edge, but when it comes to the left and right edges, you can start the cut 1/3 of the way down or 2/3 of the way down. That's to match the 3x2 sixes. So you will need some alterations. Yes, DCRS. That's something I've not demonstrated, unfortunately, but 2.5 has something called DRCS, which is like user-defined graphics on the ZX Spectrum or VDU23 on the BBC Micro. You can actually define your own characters on a 12x10 matrix of dots. The only reason my editor doesn't use it yet is because the definitions of DRCS are stored on a hidden page, a hexadecimal page like the answers to Bamboozle are, and my editor only sees one page at a time. It's something I've always wanted to do in my editor, but it's one of those many little things I have in my big jar of round chewits, if anyone gets that phrase. I don't get around to it, round to it.
Yes.
Thank you for explaining that. I weren't up to speed on that, but thank you. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions over there. I'll go. Alistair, you had your hand up for. Okay, I'll just go to Alistair first because I think I know who they're talking about. It's Massey Ferguson tractor from them UDGs as well.
I was going to say, I won't make you all swivel round, but if you want to look afterwards, I've got some demonstrations of the dynamically redefinable character sets, so you can see how it appears on the TV and how how high resolution it looks compared to everything
Mhm.
else.
Yeah, he's a step ahead of me in that DRCS.
But not heavy.
Okay, right. I shall. Got a question there, gentleman at the front.
Right, I'm sorry if this sounds daft here. I'm sitting with all these experts in this room, right? I'm assuming that level 1 is the teletext that was on my TV in 1980 when I first got CFAX and all
That's
that,
correct,
right?
yes.
So is level 2.5, was that the Philips TV I bought in 1995 that had fast text?
The only way to find out is to select page 753 on TVAX. Well, the trouble is, level 2.5, level 1, well, you said about fast text just now, that was an extension to level 1, using row 24 for the text prompt you see at the bottom and packet 27 to define where the page numbers go. That's sort of a tiny extension to level 1. The trouble with level 2.5, it's not something that the TV makers tend to shout about, not in their manuals or anything like that, or in their brochures or anything like that. Mid-90s, I'm not confident that it would have 2.5.
Maybe 1.5.
1.5 is accented characters.
Right.
And so if I wind back to, I keep mentioning page 753 of TFAX. That's what it is. If I pop to 1.5, I don't know why the oh, there it is. Yeah, 1.5 just has the accented character here, the E with the I think it's called a breathe above it. If it's not there, then it's level 1. If it is there, then it's level 1.5. And if you get all the fancy extra colours, it's 2.5.
Finally, you haven't mentioned 3.5. Is that the famous Philips thing that was in the television magazine where you could get colour photographs?
No, that was level 4. That was the originally proposed level, and Jason said we've not really found any specimens or specifications of how level 4 or 5 worked. You say 3.5. As far as we know, there aren't any 3.5 decoders in existence. There could be one, teletext-manager.de, that could do 3.5. On 2.5, we saw underlined text. On 3.5, you can also have bold and italic. But other than that, 3.5 rather, is the same as 2.5, only you've got a lot less limitations. We said that only CLUTS 2 or 3 can be redefined from the palette. You can see it changes to you can't do this icon on CLUTS 01. But on 3.5, you can redefine all 32 colours. So all 32 colours can be chosen from the palette of 4096. You know, that's kind of the most significant, looser limitation that's been released on 3.5. And you say, we were talking about DRCS just now, you can simulate full bitmap graphics with that, because on 2.5 DRCS you only have pixels which are foreground or background, but 3.5 DRCS allows you to have 4 colour or 16 colour graphics. And I think you can, I can't remember how many you can, I think you can have, if they were all 16 colour ones, you could have up to 96 redefined characters. So if you had a design which was 96 characters big, then yes, you could do that as a little full bitmap on 3.5, but you'd need quite a lot of hidden pages to store the data, which would slow things down for the old level 1 decoders that don't memorise the pages.
Also, yeah, okay.
That's right.
The other thing with 1.5 as well, I think what it does is it allows you to display black on white.
Black foreground.
Yeah, so I can put black characters over a white background.
I'm not really sure about that, because according to the rather lengthy ETSI, I can't remember what number it is, but that rather big document that you must never leave home without, according to that, level 2.5, officially that's the first level which does support black foreground, again because there were gaps, but again, like the double width and the double height, that seems to have been unofficially adopted by level 1 and level 1.5 decoders. I think the first I had a Toshiba telly made in 1990. That was the first decoder I came across, level 1 decoder, that did do black foreground attributes. There was a test page hidden on somewhere on Oracle page 693, which had a couple of white stripes, which looked like white stripes on the old teletext, but telly we had from 1983. But on the 1991 Toshiba, I had a look at that page again, and those white stripes suddenly had black foreground text on them. My advice would be on black foreground is not to use it if at all possible, but if you have to use it, put what I call the safety foreground blue attribute before it. So if you have an old decoder which doesn't do black foreground, it will at least appear in blue and still be readable.
No, thank you for that. I've seen another question over in the corner over there. Let's go over. There you go.
Couple of quick questions. Is there a limit in the amount of attribute triplets you can put in?
There is actually. When I said that the enhancements were on packet 26, it's actually possible to broadcast more than one packet 26 on the same page. So you can have up to 16 packet 26s, and I think there's room for 13 enhancements. Let's see if I can flip to a page. Which page has the most enhancements on it? Probably this one. If you look on the left side of the table, you can see there's D0, T0, D0, T1. D0 is what's called a designation code, which is the first packet 26, and there are 13 of those lines in each of those packets. So after triplet 12 in the first packet, then goes to D1 triplet 0, which is the second packet. And again, that gives you another 13 commands. You can have up to 16 packet 26s, each with 13 enhancements in them. And I think that will give you a total, I think it's 208 enhancements. I think that's the total amount of enhancements you can have on one self-contained page.
And when did they start saying level 2.5 and 3.5? I remember originally it was just level 1, level 2/3. And when did the 0.5s come in?
I'm not really sure about that. I think there's a couple of people who can answer that better than I can. Excuse me. The original level 2 specification was to have more character sets and more colours in it. But then, some way along the line, they decided, it's a lot harder to put in the colours than it is to define the characters. So originally, level 2 would be more characters, more colours. And so they came up with a spec with just the 8 colours but more characters. And because that was halfway between level 1 and level 2, that's how we end up with level 1.5. And 2.5 has the DRCS, which was originally going to be part of level 3. I'm not sure exactly which went about, because there were level 2 transmissions, test transmissions on Oracle being done as early as the mid-80s, I think. The 0.5s seem to have appeared about the mid-90s, but I could be wrong.
Thank you. Yes, yeah. From what I understand, the 0.5 designation was a halfway house between the standard below and the standard above.
Yeah.
I think it was it the Granada Job Finder service that used the level 2?
Yes. Yes, I don't have any slides of that, unfortunately, and that was only ever broadcast in Vision. That wasn't actually carried on BBI lines, as far as we know. But in the mid-90s, CFAX pages from CFAX in Vision went through a phase of showing the enhanced pages, which I think was the original level 2 specification. Didn't have the DRCS ones, which is mostly the same as 2.5. There are a couple of differences. The palette information is in a slightly different place, and also the way level 1 foreground attributes work after an enhanced foreground below. I think that works slightly differently. I think Alistair's toyed with that, and Jason might have as well.
Yes. Jason, do you want to add to it?
I've got an obscure teletext fact of the day. Going back to alphanumeric black, the original CFAX engineering test page, which we saw an adapted version of earlier on, that first came about in the late 70s, and that has on row 5 there, I think under row 2 I think as well, it has code in there to test for alphanumeric black. So if your decoder supports alphanumeric black, the lines appear disjointed, the yellow and green have spaces in them, but if it doesn't support alphanumeric black, then the lines are continuous.
Yeah, this is actually a copy I made. It's not the original.
Not the original, yeah, but that's how it is on the original.
Yeah,
but I mean, after that, I've got a controversial question. It's not even a question for Gavin, it's a question for Mort. Did Intelfax ever consider using level 2.5? Why not?
Because
Hiya. Most of the services that we were providing as Intelfax were on very restricted VBI lines, so we simply didn't have the space, the capacity to think about level 2.5. And certainly when I left Intelfax, which was in 2001, there were no plans to get into level 2.5. I've been fascinated by Gavin's presentation. It taught me two things. A, that you can do wonderful things with level 2.5.
Oh, of course.
And B, it's bloody complicated and very difficult.
It is complicated, yes. Like, I didn't time how much time it took to do the Oracle example, smooth out there. It took quite a bit of time. Putting the slopes there, and that's just for a little logo. If you had a nice hillside, putting a mosaic there, and a mosaic there. Takes quite a long time. Even I have considered putting in a slope on a level 1 artwork just to enhance it. And by the time I got to the photo, I thought, nah, just keep it.
Actually, there's something that comes out of that, Gavin. A lot of the examples that you showed us today were based on enhancing existing level 1 artwork. If you're creating, like the cat, for example, how long did that take you to put that together?
The cat one, that was actually, the cat's mostly level 1, actually. Nathan put something on his on the social network formerly known as Twitter. He puts pictures of his cat every now and then, and I just took a photograph of that. And I used Alistair's editor first to make a level 1 version because that has the ability to trace photographs, which this one doesn't have. So because of that, I do use Alistair's editor a lot. And then I pull that into this one because never forget level 1 when you make a 2.5 artwork, because at the end of the day, it always enhances a level 1 page, and the level 1 page still has to look good. The cat, the majority of the work there was done on tracing the image and getting it looking good on level 1, because there aren't that many enhancements on the cat. It's just the round corners of the eyes and the shades of brown there. That's literally the only enhancements in that. But something like like this picture, that was more difficult. Having to stuff in those full row colours, and again to fix the background colours, and each time you do something on the level 1 page, it would sort of wonkify the 2.5, so you'd have to fix it again. So this one did take me quite a lot of time to do. If I scroll through the list of enhancements, 26, 39, 52, there are 62 enhancements in that, which I had to put in one by one.
Okay, but you started from the basic level 1 version of that, right? Okay.
Yes.
And then you put in the enhancements slowly.
Yeah, that's the gist. You always do the level 1 page first.
Right.
You might have an idea of where to put in a smooth mosaic. Like if you make big lettering, for example. Like on this one, I always had an idea of. Yes, if I make this, I'm going to put one. Sort of a mosaic on each one of those, and when I put it, I made the lettering with that in mind, and when I put it down, I thought, there should be an inner corner there, and put that there.
Okay, thanks, Ken.
That's all right.
Thank you, More. Thanks for that question. And are there any more questions from the floor at all? We have one now.
From David.
This is proving very popular.
Thank you, Carl. More of an observation. We do actually have a legally distinct home of the double height burger who you could use for one of those pages. So
Okay.
I shall show you later. Paul Rose has not been sued so far. So
No, you got into trouble for a few other things, though.
yes, but we may have a word from our sponsor at some point later in the proceedings. So yes, we're liking that. So thank you.
Excellent. Equally breast. Right, lovely. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Graham. It's brilliant. Graham?
No, I'm not Graham.
No.
I'm Gavin.
Gavin.
No, not many people know my
My
name.
first ever mistake. It's been caught in Twitch.
Well, I won't mention the mistakes about separated cyan mosaics.
For the uninitiated in the audience, there's I say it one way and everybody else says it the wrong way, and that's with a few things. Was it segregated graphics, cyan, and level 2.5?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but as you've seen, it's horrible doing text in 2.5.
exactly. Well, I'll tell you what. The one observation I will pick up from that, and I think Mort touched on it as well, is the fact that it's very elegant, very it's great, and it's probably where teletext could have gone if it had stayed active for longer. But the person power, the labour that was involved to bring them pages up would take away the direct, instant nature of teletext if you wanted to run a page up.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The advertising side of teletext would love it because of the ability to produce logos properly and to use the enhanced palette. But I think the editorial side would go, what the hell is that? Because the whole point was to get the information out as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And you can say a lot of things about level 2.5 from Gavin's presentation, but quick it ain't.
No, certainly not quick. And also there's the problem that all the enhancements have to be carried in extra teletext packets, which would slow down the carousel speed.
You can imagine certain comedians waiting for the teletext page to come round on that, couldn't you?
Yeah.
I
Alistair's got one.
Alistair?
Questions keep coming.
I was just going to say, do you want to say a word about objects? Because that solves that.
I think we've overrun already.
But just to say that there's ways you can have
Right,
use the enhancements for multiple pages.
Right. Alistair's just said the O word. Objects. As well as storing the enhancements on the main page, I was worried that someone was going to mention this. Thank you, Alistair. As well as storing the enhancements on the same page, it's also possible to store the enhancement triplets on, again, hidden hexadecimal pages, have the enhancements there and invoke them from just once from the page. So if you have a broadcaster logo, say, which you use on a lot of pages, you can define that broadcaster logo just once, and you can invoke that on every page just with the one enhancement. And I believe there is a way you can do it without enhancements on the magazine organisation table. I think, as you might have...
Default logo on lots of pages, so then the editorial people don't.
The editorial people don't even have to know it's happening then.
Yeah, but objects in the enhancement packets are much harder than they seem. The reason for that is where the trouble starts is when your object puts an attribute in. So if your broadcaster logo itself, if the enhancements there themselves have a navy blue foreground and a golden yellow background, and your object puts those in, when you get to the right side of the object, what should happen? Should the attributes remain as they are on the page, or should they revert back to how they were before? And if that isn't bad enough, if there's a spacing attribute already on the page, which your object's going to go on top of, should that enhancement attribute should that existing attribute be allowed to touch the object? If you had a green mosaic, should that make the object become, your logo become green, or should your logo be immune to that? There's actually 3 different types of objects where the attributes interact in different ways, which will probably take another half hour to explain how those work. But one does influence the pages. So if you had if your Warcaster logo, say, introduced a nice blue banner across the rest of the page, you could do that as what's called an active object, because you want the object to recolour the top of the page. But if you wanted your object to be immune from the attributes on the underlying page, there's the passive object, and then there's adaptive objects, which are kind of midway between the two, which start out by being allowed to be influenced by the control codes on the page unless they define an attribute of their own, where they become immune. And on top of that, if there's any attribute changes underneath where an object is, where the object ends, the attributes that took place hidden now become shown again. I have to tell you, I've rewritten my editor at least 6 or 7 times just for the object behavior to get that to behave correctly. So my advice, if you want to write a 2.5 decoder, is don't.
Well, that's excellent advice, maybe to close it with. I think for this presentation. Thank you very much again.
Thank you as well. Thank you.
Yeah.